Hi, class. Welcome to your second lecture of this week. If you haven't had a chance to watch our first lecture that was posted a couple of days ago, do go watch it, please. No skipping. Because as you will see, especially in the weekly sequences, lectures do kind of complement each other, and they are like the topic we covered during the second day of the week usually is a continuation of the topic that we have started in the beginning of that week. So please do keep that in mind. And then, with that said, we should remind ourselves that during our first lecture this week, the topic of our study were the beginnings of humans, the beginnings of the first Western civilizations. We have studied some of the examples of those civilizations, including the first cities and the first city of Summer, and then the subsequent cities springing in that general Sumerian region. We have studied Babylonian Empire, we have studied the Akkadian Empire. And so, with that, we had kind of concluded the study of these first civilizations that will be concentrated in the region of Mesopotamia. However, at the same time, that the Sumerian city states and all of these first empires will be appearing in Mesopotamia, a very different political entity will grow in the valley of the Nile River in the North African continent, and that was, of course, the Egypt. And historically, Egyptians have had some contact with peoples of Mesopotamia. However, they will grow largely separate or as a separate civilization. But the establishment of the Egyptian civilization, much like the Mesopotamian as well, was also determined by its proximity to the river. Remember, with Mesopotamia, we've had Euphrates and Tigris rivers. And in the case of Egypt, we, of course, have the Nile River. And the river was kind of crucial to the life of Egyptians because it provided a very much needed flooding for the civilization itself. And the river itself will flood approximately once a year for a period of several months, therefore creating a fertile soil, and therefore that territory was suitable for construction of first cities and hence civilization. And the cool thing about the Nile River, unlike Mesopotamian Euphrates and Tigris rivers, was that Nile will not require any type of special irrigation systems, and it required very little work to make the land suitable for cultivation. So the fertile soil and the moisture, as a result of its proximity to the river, will of course be suitable for farming and agriculture. And so, naturally, just like Mesopotamia, the agricultural villages will start to form along the river first. And that is what you are seeing on the map to the right side of your slide, is those first urban centers developing alongside the Nile. The earliest city like communities of the Nile Valley will start emerging approximately in the year 4000 BCE. And this will occur first in the territory known as the Lower Egypt, closer to the delta of the Nile River, right here, touching the Mediterranean Sea. And then later, also, cities will develop in the lower portion or in the upper Egypt, or in the more southward portions of what later will become Egypt as well. And the river itself, the Nile River, was so important that the Egyptians would write songs, write prayers to the river itself, hoping that somehow, if we pray for the river, if we dedicate songs to it, it will flood correctly, or that it wouldn't flood too much or too high or too low, destroying the crops. And so here is an example of one of those prayers slash dedications to the Nile River. It says, "Hail to thee, O Nile, that issues from earth and comes to keep Egypt alive. He that waters the meadows, which Re or Ra, one of the gods, created. He that makes to drink the desert. He who makes barley and brings wheat into being. He who brings grass into being for the cattle. He who makes every beloved tree to grow. O Nile, verdant art thou, who makest man and cattle to live." So they understood that the river, which occurs naturally, is essential for the Egyptian subsistence. And the river itself had somewhat of a holy status, or somewhat of a cult following, so to speak. And it was because the Nile, because the river itself was stable, its flooding was predictable. Again, it was very easy for those reasons for Egyptians to navigate the river itself. So Egyptians kind of almost felt that they are blessed with the higher powers. And for those reasons, Nile will serve as almost a unifying force for Egyptians. And when I say unifying force, that means that all of these cities that will first kind of be springing up along the river itself will then at one point, well, precisely in the year 3100 BCE, kind of be united together. And the person who will unify all of these Egyptian independent cities into a single entity will be the king called Menes, again in the year 3100 BCE. He will organize Egypt as one unified kingdom. And it is this moment of unification that is often considered as a reference point for the origin of the Egyptian culture, for the origin of Egyptian society and civilization. Now, historians usually, as you know, we've seen this with the examples from previous lecture, dividing the eras into Paleolithic and Neolithic. Kind of the same logic in terms of having to classify certain periods will apply to the study of Egypt as well. And historians will use different kinds of categories to study the history of Egypt. So you could divide the history of Egypt between one way is to divide them between the so-called kingdoms. And the other one is the other way to divide periods of Egyptian history is to divide them by dynasties. And when speaking of the first classification, speaking of division by kingdoms, Egypt can be divided between three. First one is old, second one is the middle, and third one is the new kingdom period. And each of these separate kingdom periods were associated with a time of, long-term stability, extended periods of peace, times of prosperity marked by strong leaders, strong pharaohs, strong leadership, a period of great infrastructural projects, infrastructural improvements, and perhaps rich cultural life as well. And in between each of these kingdoms, meaning between old and middle, and between middle and new, they were these so-called intermediate periods. And what they signify is periods of change, periods of perhaps chaos, weak politics, corruption, or foreign threats threatening the stability of Egypt. So, for example, the intermediate period between Old and the Middle Kingdom is associated with the period of severe drought. So, in few instances, the Nile will experience some environmental issues and it will not provide the necessary nourishment for the Egyptian people, thereby signaling the end of a very prosperous old period. And then between the Middle and the New Kingdoms, this intermediate period will be signaled by the foreign invasions. People that will be called Hyksos, the foreign people, will threaten and corrupt the borders of the Egyptian empire and threaten its stability, right? Um, and also, aside from the kingdoms, historians like to divide periods of Egyptian history into different dynasties based on the names of the kings or pharaohs who ruled a certain period, or these powerful families which had ruled Egypt for generations. And throughout the history of ancient Egypt, that is between the year 3100 BCE, when Menes again united Egypt, and the year 30 BC, there were approximately 30 different dynasties ruling and shaping to some capacity the history of the ancient Egypt. We, of course, will not have time to cover all of that, all these periods, all of these dynasties. But what we have time to do, anyways, will be to focus on two major Egyptian periods, or these kingdom periods, rather, that were the most significant. And these will be the Old Kingdom and the New Kingdom. So, first, let's examine developments of the Old Egyptian period, or the Old Kingdom. Now, following the unification of the Upper and the Lower Egypt, Egyptians will enter the Old Kingdom period, which will, of course, be known as the era of prosperity, artistry, and yes, the era of construction of the first Egyptian pyramids. And the Old Kingdom is also a period during which we see the emergence of the first Egyptian kings and queens, also known as pharaohs. And in fact, during the Old Kingdom, Pharaoh becomes sort of this focal point of both religious as well as political life in Egypt. And he or she, they, were typically in control of things like treasury, had control over how resources will be distributed within the society, in charge of creating and drafting and enforcing the laws themselves. So, kind of think of a role of a president, kind of the chief executive, if you will, with all of these rights and responsibilities. And that is to say that Pharaoh will have this responsibility to organize Egypt into a very strong and hence very centralized state. And at the time, actually, there was no idea, no sense of sharing the power, of separation of powers themselves, right? But rather, all decisions were made by a single person, that person being the pharaoh themselves. And just like in Mesopotamia, where people and kings believed that kings were kind of anointed or put in power by gods themselves, people in Egypt too will believe that pharaohs are indeed divinely ordained, and there was also this sense of divine kinship, right? And in fact, Egyptians will push this connection between the king and God a step further, and they divided, or actually they viewed pharaohs as direct descendants of gods, and thus view the pharaohs as gods themselves, right? So pharaohs were perceived as the walking embodiments, or the incarnations of the God itself on earth, right? And they will enjoy, or the pharaohs will enjoy the status of somewhere like in between human and divine. And they were believed, again, to have been chosen by the God himself or herself to serve as people's mediators on earth. And initially, Egyptians believed that the pharaoh was the incarnation, the lively embodiment, the representative of God Horus. And Horus is the sky god in the ancient Egyptian mythology. And some kings of the Egyptian tradition will also claim that they are the direct descendants of the god Ra, who was the great god of sun. And so, again, according to Egyptian culture, gods and kings and queens or pharaohs are even more directly, even closely related than they were in Mesopotamia, right? In Egypt, kings are perceived as gods themselves, as walking gods on earth, God's replicas on earth. And when the pharaoh dies, according to Egyptian tradition, culture, religion, when the king or queen dies, he or she become the god Osiris, which is the god of the dead. Now, the institution of Pharaoh was important to Egyptians, not only because they were this divine representation, an embodiment of God on earth, but also because Egyptians believed that Pharaoh is in charge or in control of preserving something called Ma'at. And the word Ma'at represents a state of balance, a state of control, a state of a harmony itself, a harmony of truth, of justice, morality, integrity. So, a person who maintains Ma'at makes the society happy. And that was one of the pharaoh's duties as well, to kind of preserve that almost cosmic harmony. And Ma'at gives the king the right, the authority, and the duty to govern because it's the pharaoh's duty to preserve it. And this concept was important because to the people, again, the pharaoh personifies not only God, but also personifies justice and order. And pharaoh is the person who maintains this harmony between the people, between the nature, and the divine itself. Now, next, let's even more closely examine some of the religious aspects of Egyptians. And just like Mesopotamians, the Egyptians will develop their religion as polytheistic, worshiping not one, but again, many gods. And the crucial feature of Egyptian religion is belief in afterlife, the belief that your spirit carries on even after your body is biologically deceased. And in order to make that process of transition from your life on earth to your afterlife adventures, in order to make this transition smooth, the pharaohs, since the Old Kingdom period, will spend vast sums of money on huge tombs in the form of pyramids. So pyramids will be built to serve as a royal burial site or the literal graves of the deceased pharaohs. And Egypt's largest pyramids will be built during the Old Kingdom period. And these are the pyramids that you are currently looking on your slide, the pyramids of Giza. And the largest and the tallest of these pyramids will be the one that you see here on the middle, simply known as the Great Pyramid. And it was built as a burial site for a pharaoh named Khuftu. This one, the Great Pyramid, is the tallest and the largest. It's almost 500 feet tall. It was made with 2.3 million blocks of limestone, and it covers almost 13 acres of land. It was also the tallest human made structure until the French will build their Eiffel Tower in the 19th century. Now, there is a lot of debate over who built the pyramids, who did the hard lifting. And by that, I'm not referring to those who might come on Earth on flying saucers. um, but the popular history has it that, aside from focusing on aliens, let's not do that. The popular history also has it that the pyramids were built by enslaved labor. So, indeed, honestly, enslavement, the institution of slavery, was a very common practice among all ancient civilizations. Especially in Egypt, this will be true during the New Kingdom period, when poor Egyptians, peasants, children, foreigners, war captives were very frequently taken as slaves. However, we must dispute the suggestion that enslaved persons, such as those coming from Israel, as Hollywood movies would have it portrayed, built Egyptian pyramids. Because just recently, archaeologists in Egypt will excavate skeletons from the area that will show that the workers who built the pyramids were probably approximately 20,000 of the native Egyptian agricultural laborers who had worked on those pyramids during the time when the Nile River flooded. And so instead of working on the fields, which they would normally do, but are now unable to do because there is flooding, they will focus on building the pyramids at Giza, and they will be paid for their labor. And the builders were these skilled Egyptian workers who will live in a nearby temporary city. These are the excavations recently discovered that you are currently looking on the slide. And they were discovered in the southeastern area at the Giza Plateau, or this valley in which pyramids will be built. And archaeologists will excavate remains of houses, remains of streets, remains of administrative buildings, all of which suggest, and also the elements of fish, the elements of cattle and sheep bones. And all of this kinds of suggests that the workers were kind of well fed for their labor and were also very much in good health, perhaps slightly exploited due to the heat in the area, but nevertheless not enslaved by any means. Back to the main topic, which is again religion in the ancient Egypt. The chief function of these pyramids was to provide, again, a final resting place for Pharaoh and to ensure Pharaoh's safe journey into the afterlife. And ancient Egyptians believed that when Pharaoh dies, their body enters the land of the dead, the land of Osiris, but they would live on in the afterlife. So just because they're dead doesn't mean they're really dead, right? They will continue their life as they knew it on earth, but just in the world of Osiris for the moment. And ancient Egyptians believed that when Pharaoh dies, part of their spirit, known as Ka, remains in their body. And so, in order for king or queen to successfully enter into the afterlife and to take care of the pharaoh's spirit, the corpse needed to be mummified. And this mummification process is a process of embalming, where the embalmers or people performing this ritual will first proceed to remove all of the organs to kind of clean the body, and then they would apply the solution or a solvent containing mixture of palm oil and wine to the insides and outsides of the body. And then the soon to be mummified body was placed in a solution called the natron, which is a naturally occurring salt, and it was left to dry for 40 days. And after the flesh will be dehydrated, the body was then wrapped in layers upon layers of linen. And the reason why Egyptian developed this, what turned out to be a very long and costly ritual, is because that they believed that in order to be whole in the afterlife, your body needs to be preserved, right? And mummification kind of allowed the spirit of deceased person to recognize its own body in the afterlife, so the two can again be reunited. And as you probably know, kings, aside from being mummified and buried in pyramids, will also be buried with objects like silver, gold, jewelry, linen, mirrors, you name it, right? And these were put there not only to showcase the wealth of a certain pharaoh, but Egyptians also believed that kings actually needed to be buried with these objects because they will use these objects in the afterlife as well. And during the period of the Old Kingdom, mummification will turn out to be will start, and it will start as the exclusive privilege of the royalty, because as you could imagine, all of this costed a lot of money. And only top echelon elites were mummified. But later, especially during the Middle Kingdom period and even more so during the New Kingdom period, the ritual becomes more widespread and mummification becomes more democratized in that it was accessible to a greater number of people, the greater number of Egyptians. Now, during the Old Kingdom period, Egyptians will also develop very complex ideas about the afterlife, and they would record these ideas into what becomes known as the Book of the Dead, which was a collection of prayers that that a person is supposed to pray for somebody's passage into the afterlife. And portions of that you will be reading as a primary source for this week. And the Book of the Dead kind of represents somewhat of what we would call, a recital or simply a prayer or a list of rituals and codes that are supposed to guide the deceased into the next life. And a book or a guide kind of suggests how to navigate through the difficulties of the underworld before reaching the afterlife. And it kind of reveals to us how Egyptians believed people should behave in order to pass, or in order to have a good and successful afterlife, because they of course believed that one's destination after death largely depends on one's action while they are living. So you're supposed to be a good person if you want to reach the afterlife. So, in summary, the Old Kingdom of Egypt period was a period in history associated with the establishment of Egyptian religion, establishment of Egyptians' first pharaohs, and the building of the first pyramids. But another influential Egyptian kingdom period worth mentioning is that of a new kingdom, because the new kingdom will perhaps be kind of the golden age of the ancient Egypt, because then Egypt will grow as the wealthiest, the largest, and when I say the largest, I mean in terms of territorial expansion. And pharaohs during the New Kingdom will launch a wide-ranging expeditions, taking over the lands of the people in the south, the peoples of the territory called Nubia, predominantly Kush people, and also territories that we today associate with the Middle East along the Mediterranean Sea, all of which will become territories controlled by the Pharaoh during the New Kingdom period. Now, we've already said that Egyptians understood Pharaoh to be this avatar of God Horus, this source of law, the source of morality, and this a mediator of gods and humans. And the Pharaoh's connection to this divine will stretch also to the members of their family, so that, the Pharaoh's siblings, the Pharaoh's children were also kind of viewed as divine in some ways. And because of this, pharaohs, in order to become stronger, in order to expand even more territory, extend their wealth, will also take their sisters or their half sisters as one of their wives. And the idea here is that if we intermarry inside of our own family, we are actually preserving the purity of royal blood. We will make divine blood, we will make this royal blood even more concentrated, and this will set us apart, us the royals, from the rest of the Egyptians, from the commoners, right? Who in general, did not marry their closest relatives like pharaohs will. A pharaoh often chose one of his wives, often a relative, to be, quote, the great royal wife, or the so called first lady of Egypt, if you will, or the principal queen. And for that reason, these family connections with the divine will allow a handful of women to actually branch out and, as such, become queens in their own merit. And there were actually 7 total of the female pharaohs in Egyptian history. Now, some historians argue there were more than 7, which is very likely, but we know at least 7 of them ruled independently and alone. Okay, and the most famous among them certainly was Queen Hatshepsut. And Hatshepsut, she ruled for 20 years during the mid 15th century BCE, so during the New Kingdom period. And she will start her reign because she first ruled alongside her husband, Thutmose II. And after Thutmose passed away, it will be their stepson, Thutmose III, who will temporarily assume the throne. However, Hatshepsut will eventually seize the power from him, and she will begin to rule as the sole pharaoh. Her status as a woman in power was perhaps difficult for many Egyptians to grasp. And because she was the only one of the handful of women who had the privilege to be in position of power, she believed that her femininity and her feminine looks might make her lose some of her legitimacy. She might, the people will start to think that she is not authoritative ruler if she looks like a woman. So her goal will be to kind of reinvent her image. And in the statues and paintings made of her at the time, she ordered that she must be portrayed with masculine features, including beard including large muscles and kind of wearing a male attire, looking less and less feminine over the years. And this transition of Hatshepsut into adopting the masculine features that, kind of suggests to us that even though women had the right to rule in Egypt independently, this will not come without challenges, and that in Egypt or the Egyptian or in the Egyptian language of power, if you wanted to be taken seriously, male was the norm and female will be the exception. And in her many years of power, Hatshepsut didn't just hang on her position by her fingernails. She also owned, or she ruled at the time when women were not meant to rule as she did. And don't take my word for it. Here are the words of Hatshepsut herself. She said, quote, "Every pharaoh god says to himself, one who will achieve eternal continuity has come, whom Amun-Ra has caused to appear as king of eternity on Horus's throne. So listen, all your elite and multitude of commoners. I have done this by the plan of my mind. I did not sleep forgetting, but have made firm what is ruined. I came as Horus, the sole ruler, spitting fire at my enemies," right? So I guess as a woman, Hatshepsut felt as if she had a lot to prove. And she actually will be successful, not only with spitting fire at her enemies, but also because she will be remembered for undertaking very ambitious projects, including infrastructural projects, particularly in the area of the city of Thebes, kind of here in the middle of the Egypt, which was, and in the city of Thebes, she will construct one of the architectural wonders of the ancient Egypt, the Temple of the Hir el Bahri, which was built during Hatshepsut's rule. And another one of her great achievements will be that she will start a large trading expedition, and that she will authorize to bring back the riches, including ivory, ebony, gold, leopard skins, to Egypt from Eastern African kingdoms. So there will be a large connection of trade between Egypt and Eastern African kingdoms during this period. And so her reign will kind of usher this moment of architectural creativity, of economic prosperity. And sadly, but perhaps not surprisingly, when Hatshepsut died, her stepson, Thutmose III, will try to destroy all of the evidence that she had ever ruled. And he would smash numerous statues, and he would scratch her name off of any written records, perhaps because of personal animosity, perhaps out of the sense of jealousy that she and not him was the queen, or because he wanted to erase the fact that a woman had once been a pharaoh of Egypt. And it was only within recent decades that historians and archaeologists had found evidence of Hatshepsut's reign and were kind of able to piece together her achievements. And this personal animosity, and this desire of some men in power to erase the memory of female pharaohs is perhaps the reason why we still don't know the names of all of the legacy of all of the pharaohs, and we still don't know the legacies of all of the female pharaohs in particular and their legacies and achievements altogether. But nevertheless, we can conclude that the rule of Hatshepsut was a period of a great growth in New Egyptian Kingdom, or during the New Egyptian Kingdom period. Now, we said that Egyptians embraced polytheistic religion, which was, belief in many gods, which was true for Egypt for the most part. But there was the exception that was made during the reign of King Akhenaten, who also had ruled during the New Kingdom period. And Akhenaten will promote instead the worship of just one god, the sun god of Aten, also sometimes spelled as Aten. And he will say, Akhenaten will say that he is the only god that Egyptians are now supposed to worship, right? And for a brief period of Egyptian history, ancient Egyptian history, that is to say, precisely for 17 years, Egypt was monotheistic in that there was a person who will say, you are now only supposed to believe in one God. And during the rule of Akhenaten, Egyptians will also be forced to remove any of the representations of other polytheistic gods. Numerous temples will be closed, temples worshiping other gods who Akhenaten will not approve, and he will deem them as illegal to worship other gods, which kind of speaks volumes of the power that the pharaohs had, in that they not only controlled political life of Egypt, but they also were in control of the production of religion and how Egyptians are supposed to worship and exercise their culture. Also, very known fact about Akhenaten is that he will be married to a famous queen, Nefertiti. And during the Akhenaten's rule, Nefertiti will be this great royal wife. And she, as the wife of a pharaoh, will actually too assume some positions of powers herself. And she will be very supportive of her husband's new religion, the monotheistic religion. And the extent of power and the influence of Nefertiti is something that historians, Egyptologists are still trying to decipher. And on the artifacts that you are currently looking on the slide, she is actually often portrayed as a person performing religious rituals, which was normally a role reserved strictly for the pharaoh himself. And another artifact here on the bottom is the famous bust of Nefertiti, which was discovered by German archaeologists in 1900s. It's a limestone statue of Queen Nefertiti, which kind of, ever since it was discovered, gave Nefertiti this status symbol of the ultimate Egyptian femininity and beauty as well. Now, Nefertiti and Akhenaten had 6 children. They had 6 daughters. However, Akhenaten began taking other wives because he was hoping that maybe a different wife can provide for a male heir, for the male offspring. And for that purpose, Akhenaten will also marry his sister, hoping she could give him a son. And a son they did produce. And the offspring of that relationship will be the famous King Tutankhamun, also known by its shorter version, the King Tut, who will become the next pharaoh. And he will be only 9 years of age when he came to the throne. However, as he grew older, he will abandon the monotheism for Egyptians. He will abandon the worship of one god put in place by his father, and instead resort back to polytheism, resort back to polytheistic religion for Egyptians. And King Tut will become famous through the discovery of his tomb in 1922, which revealed the sheer wealth of his kingship. And there were over 5,000 of different artifacts found by his burial site, including a solid gold coffin, also the famous face mask you're currently looking at on the slide, which was made entirely of gold. And in terms of his legacy, he will die. Well, he will pass away when he was 19 years old. And although the findings regarding the cause of the death are still fairly inconclusive, uh, people have discovered that from his mummy that he had suffered from malaria and also had a malformed foot, which kind of made him limp. And the malfunction in foot appeared to have been genetical defect because, after all, he was a son, or he was a product of a brother and sister marriage. But nevertheless, the artifacts found by his tomb, I guess, by his mummy, indicate to us the sheer wealth that Egypt was experiencing during the King Tut's rule. So between the years of 3000 BCE to approximately 1000 BCE, the kingdoms in Mesopotamia, as well as the kingdoms of Egypt, as we just studied, were kind of the strongest, the wealthiest, the mightiest. And the rest of the people, the rest of the powers, had just kind of had to keep up with those two. At this point, it is important to mention that Mesopotamian and Egyptian civilizations bloomed during the historic period called the Bronze Age. And Bronze Age lasted roughly between the years 3300 and 1200 BCE. And it marked the first time that humans will start to work with metal. And the Bronze Age ended rather abruptly with near simultaneous collapse of the so-called Bronze Age empires, or the Bronze Age civilizations, with Babylonians, with Egyptians being one of them. And without getting into too much details, speaking of the Egyptian empire and its collapse, it will collapse sometime in the year of 1200 BCE, because it will be troubled by invasions from the south, from the Nubian Empire, and from the north, when it will be the Hittites who will be invading the territory of Egypt from its northern portions. Now, after that, after this invasion and subsequent fall of the Egypt, it will be different kinds of powers, the smaller types of kingdoms, the mighty empires of the West, as I like to call them, who will kind of enter the stage and take the throne in terms of military, economic, and political supremacy of the territory of Egypt and Mesopotamia. And they will do so with the power of the new technology. And that technology will be technology of smelting iron. So Egypt declines, and we are entering the so-called Iron Age approximately in the year 1100 BCE. And during this period, iron weapons will become important items of trade throughout the Mediterranean coast. And iron appears to have been adopted in Egypt kind of more slowly than in the other parts of the Near East. And for that reason, this will allow other powers to kind of penetrate and to kind of outgrow, to outperform Egypt. And one of the first civilizations of the Iron Age, the ones who will be taking advantage of this new technology, will be the so called Assyrian Empire. And Assyrians will establish their capital city in the city of Nineveh along the Tigris River. So we're kind of focusing back onto the territory of Mesopotamia. And Assyrians will form a highly centralized bureaucratic state where Assyrian kings would conquer a territory, conquer Mesopotamia and parts of Egypt, and they will turn them into a province or different provinces governed by Assyrian officials who were either the comrades of the local or of the Assyrian king himself, or they will be the native rulers kind of willing to give up their power and accept Assyrian king as their main boss, if you will. And Assyrians generally were highly militarized bunch, highly militarized civilization, almost entirely in a state of constant warfare. And Assyrian kings will establish large professional armies, and it's actually safe to say that the overall success of the Assyrian Empire, or the success of building of their empire, was due to the size of its army. And during their peak in the 7th century BCE, Assyrians had approximately 70,000 of men as a part of a formal professional army in the day and age when armies are typically not bigger than perhaps 10,000 of soldiers. And the most renowned members of the Assyrian military were the Assyrian infantrymen who were armed, of course, with this new technology, with the iron weapons. And Assyrians, we have to mention at this point, were certainly not the first civilization to use iron weapons. However, they will definitely be the first ones to produce them in massive quantities and use them to their advantage, use them for the empire building. And these weapons, as you might assume, will be superior to the Bronze Age weapons because Bronze Age tools were made from bronze materials, which were cheaper, and tools made of copper, tools made of tin, materials used to make bronze are more scarce. They're kind of more rare, and also more expensive to make. Whereas the iron and its byproduct, steel, are actually more abundant and cheaper. And so Assyrians were able to arm their military with the spread of the iron weapons, with the spread of the iron tools, and heavy armor. And particularly, they will be the ones responsible for creating the world's first siege engine, named the battering rams, which will be used to knock down the walls of or the gates of the enemy's army, or the enemy's city walls. And so, with all of this military might, they will reach their height sometime around 650 BCE, and they will create a large empire that will eventually end up taking over both the territory of Mesopotamia, if we were to go to the map before, territory of what we used to call Babylonian Empire, and Akkadian Empire before that, is now turning into Assyrian Empire, as well as the portions of Egypt, predominantly Middle East, which were at some point portions of Egypt, as well as the territories by the Nile Delta or the Nile River itself. Assyrians will not be the only people or the civilization who will take advantage of the Iron Age. And lastly, the last civilization that will thrive during this period, during the Iron Age, will be people known as Phoenicians. And Phoenicians will be a group of people who will rise to prominence along the Mediterranean coast, predominantly around the Middle East in territory that today is known as the modern day country of Lebanon. And also in the portions of the what the Christian Bible will later title as the land of Canaan, which is why the Phoenicians are sometimes referred to as the Canaanites. So Phoenicians in the Middle East will establish the cities of Tyre, the city of Byblos, and the city of Sidon, which will kind of grow as their centers of trade along the eastern shore of the Mediterranean. However, Phoenicians, what they were renowned for will be that the people will give them a nickname, the Sea Peoples, name that was given to them by the Egyptians because they were master shipbuilders, and were known as sea merchants of the world between the years of 1100 and 700 BCE. In this advantage in shipbuilding, the advantage that they have in terms of sea trading will also build them commercial prosperity as well. They will trade tools, they will trade weapons, cookware, made both out of bronze, but now also iron. And they mostly traded purple and blue textiles, from which they will also get their name because according to the Greek language, Phoenician means the purple people. And because they will trade these various goods that will be in the high demand among civilizations of the Mediterranean, particularly things like gold, things like wine, they were also generally welcomed by the visitors. And they will also found other or establish other cities as they traveled along in the territories along the northern portions of the African continent, in today's country of Tunisia, which will later be in the history known as the Carthage, as we will learn later in the semester, who will be kind of one of the main rivals of the Roman Empire. And Phoenicians will also be the reason why the future cultures, including the Greeks, including Sparta and Athens, why they will rise to prominence because the Phoenician merchants will introduce to the people of Athens and Sparta many aspects of the older and more urbanized cultures of the Mesopotamia. So Phoenicians will kind of connect and introduce Mesopotamian traditions to the people of Greece. It was also thanks to Phoenicians that we have this great cultural achievement known as the phonetic system of alphabet, meaning, we today kind of use variations of Phoenician alphabet itself. Because as we've seen with older systems of writing, for instance, cuneiform, which we have studied when we looked at Mesopotamian civilizations. Cuneiform typically had a sign or to represent a word, or a sign to represent a collection of letters. But here, Phoenicians would ascribe a letter, one single letter, to a single sound, therefore creating an alphabet, which was much more simple, much more practical in terms of developing a language, and much more accurate in terms of the record keeping. And the Greeks, who will be the next successful civilization, will later modify this alphabet and use it to construct their own language. And then, of course, the Romans, after Greeks, will base their alphabet off of the previous Greek alphabet. And we can kind of see this pattern of emulation, of copy pasting, of one civilization being influenced by the other. That's kind of going to be the topic or the overarching phenomena that we will see as we study the Western civilizations altogether. So Phoenicians, one of the mighty empires or mighty people civilizations of the East that will kind of take advantage advantage of the Iron Age to rise to prominence. This is a good place for us to stop. I kind of introduced to you the topic of ancient Greeks, which is kind of chronologically the next place we're going to meander when we meet during our next week's lectures. But for now, this has been plenty for you to digest for this week of lectures. And I hope you have enjoyed the topics covered this week. And I hope that you will find some time in your day to answer the primary source discussions, because they are due, as always, by Friday. Okay? Have a wonderful rest of your day, and I hope to see you back again next week. All right. Bye-bye.